overestimated the negative impacts. In other words, it didn't help just saying it was bad for you. They needed to find a different way of doing it. So they redefined the enemy not as smoking, but as big tobacco. The big tobacco companies who were peddling lies and deceit in order to sell their products. And they uncovered all this evidence about how they were burying reports and hiding statistics and manipulating consumers, and they made them the enemy. So in other words, they said to teenagers, if you want the truth, this is what you need to know. They never said don't smoke, they just said make up your own mind. I think that's a good example of finding a way to define your own enemy that makes sense for what you're doing, whether it's an attitude, an industry, or a particular brand or product. Next slide, please. Another example of sort of breaking the rules is for the Mini, when it was launched in the US in about 2003, the Mini couldn't afford to do big TV advertising. It didn't have the budgets to compete with the likes of VW and those other marketers in its class. But it still wanted to get on TV screens. So how do you outthink the competition and get on TV without actually buying TV airtime? And what they did was they went into sports stadiums and took out some of the seats, like 2 rows of seats, and then they put a Mini there instead, and they then put a radio sweepstakes for people who have the chance to sit in the Mini and around the Mini doing the games. And not surprisingly, the TV cameras kept going onto the Mini throughout the sports broadcast, and they got millions and millions of dollars of free airtime by doing something like that. Next slide, please. This is another part of the Mini campaign, which was a guerrilla stunt. Again, they got a huge amount of publicity where they drove around big SUVs, big off-road vehicles around major cities in the States with, instead of what you would normally have on, which is a pair of water skis or some mountain bikes, they had the Mini to both demonstrate its small size with a message that said on the side, what are you doing for fun this weekend? To position it as a fun vehicle that was different from the big competition at the time. Next slide, please. So, so this is some of the ways that things have changed, and those are some of the principles through which we're talking about. I think another main principle, and this is very pertinent to what we've been talking about in the last couple of days, is don't pander to technology. In other words, don't be seduced by all the stuff out there. This is the hub I showed you again. If you go to the next slide. This is just an example of some of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of brands and media formats that you as a marketer or advertiser can plug into to advertise your products or brands. But how do you weed through all this stuff and work out which ones you should use? It's so easy to think you should actually market and advertise in the next big thing, the next big format. But how do you do that? It seems to me that it's starting from the wrong place. And this is where I sort of preach, I guess, which is I think the thing that's missing are big ideas. And it's the big ideas that should inform the media choice. And I think there's a certain sequence that you have to use which uses some media planning in terms of where you're going to put your message, but starts from a completely different place. And that place starts with consumer insights. Make sure you really understand your consumers, and then work out what it is about their lives where your brand and product is relevant to them. And the second thing is that you need to create this big idea. Easier said than done, right? And we'll talk about that again in a minute. And the third thing is that you then need to understand how your target market interacts with different types of media. Are they on Facebook? Are they on Twitter? Do they watch TV? Do they read magazines? Do they read newspapers? Et cetera, et cetera. In other words, you have to work out what it is about their lives and which part of the media mix is relevant to them. And the third thing you have to do is execute it. You have to bring that thing to life as well as you possibly can do. And again, if you take that subservient chicken example, it only worked because it was done with such meticulous detail that people couldn't understand how it was done. If they'd just put out a little online film of a chicken dancing, it would have been lost among the millions of other videos that were trying to become viral. Next slide, please. So I think this is the questions you ask yourself as a marketer. They're really simple questions. And actually, I think the whole thing about this punk marketing revolution is that it's been true forever. It's just that along the way, people have forgotten how to engage with the consumers. But it's a very, very simple 4-stage process that you need to do. Next slide, please. So one final example, before I get on to finish up on this thing, of a campaign that I think does this stuff really well, which was a campaign for Lynx in Australia. So Lynx is a body spray for guys, And they didn't have much money to do this stuff, as these brands often don't, particularly the Australian market, where the budgets are way lower than some of the bigger markets like the US. And what they found was that their share amongst young guys, which is their main audience, was decreasing. They were getting a lot of the teenage boys, 13 to 16-year-olds, but their core market of 17 to 25-year-olds, it was losing relevance for them. So that was their sort of going-in problem. Their consumer insight was that guys of that age, 17 to 25, in Australia, it's the first time they get to travel overseas. And travel for them is about new frontiers, new experiences, and women. So that was their consumer insight. So there's something interesting about travel and their exploration and their coming of age and their contact with women for the first time in foreign places. So if you'd done a media planning way of doing this, in other words, looked at the media and said, well, how do we reach these guys, and forgot about the idea for a moment, but started with where do we get into the media, you might have bought some space around travel magazines and airports and thought about the travel experience and how do we interact with those people media-wise. But actually what they did was the smart thing, which is said, what's a big idea that will bring to life this idea that links is there through that stage of your life when you're first starting to explore for the first time and you first come in contact with sex. So what they did was they created the fantasy airline called Lynx Jet. And it was a fantasy airline with all the accoutrements of a normal airline. It had an online film that promoted the airline. It had print ads. It had safety demonstration films. And it's all about sex. It's all about beautiful flight attendants called mostesses. And if you just flick through some of the next few slides. So they had safety demonstration films with the mostesses cuddling up to the guys on the plane. They had a Mile High Club. Next slide, please. They had a series of interesting print ads, suggestive print ads. Next one. Next one. And the campaign was hugely successful. So they got to 85% market share and reached their goals in half the time they were trying to do it. And I think that's a really good example. It wasn't a big budget campaign of how the idea led the media. So then it begs the question, so how do you get to these ideas? It sounds easier said than done, and all the examples of the things I've shown you here, whether it's Mini or Biomat or Philips or Dove or Lynx Jet, had really good ideas in them. And so I just wrote this book, which came out in the UK in July. It's coming out in Germany, I think, this month, and it came out in the US in July, and it comes out in China at the end of the year, called The Business Playground. And I wrote it with this guy, Dave Stewart, who's a musician. And it's really about helping people be creative. And our premise is that everybody is creative. We've always been creative. We were very, very creative as children. And actually, sometime along the way, we sort of lose it. It gets dampened down. This probably applies less to people in the people in this conference, because I think we work in creative industries. But certainly in big business, there's a fear of creativity. It's outsourced to agencies. It's outsourced to departments within a company. Those people are weird people who wear funny glasses and black suits. But actually, we've all got it within us. And the problem with marginalizing creativity is it's only reserved for those parts of the mix where it's the polishing, the bit of fluff at the end, the way the car commercial looks, or the packaging bit. Whereas actually, creativity is needed in every part of the process. Creativity is what drives innovation. It's what helps us solve big problems like global warming, or oil spills in the Gulf, or anything in the environment or business. It's driven by innovation, which is driven by creativity. So in the book, what we do is we talk about the principles of creativity. We give people tools and techniques and some games in there. And we interview people like Mick Jagger and Paul Allen. So it's quite a fun book. Next slide, please. So I just want to finish with one thing. So this is all very well, but I wanted to give you some very specific things that you as marketers or potential marketers could do when you get back to work in the next day or two. And some of them follow some of the principles I've been talking through, but write down your industry's conventions, whatever those might be, and decide which ones you want to break. That's the way you're going to get standout. You're going to get standout by taking something which everybody else does and say you're going to do it in a slightly different way. Another thing is, I think we're often looking for the big idea that's going to change everything. And to be honest, that doesn't really exist that often. There are very few big ideas. What they usually are is a combination of lots and lots of small ideas brought together and done well. And I think that applies to Apple products, Facebook, commercials. Most innovations actually aren't big breakthrough things where people have an aha moment. There are a series of things that are packaged well. And I think what it's worth doing is, rather than trying to become a startled deer in the headlights and waiting for that big thing and doing nothing different until you find it, find some small ideas and make them really good. What is it about that your customer experience that you can make amazing, for instance? So third thing is, I can't read sideways now. Yeah, do something in your community. Like, I think community things are obviously an important thing to do. And I think it's very easy to do small things in small areas and then replicate it and do it over lots of different areas. So if you're a national advertiser or a national marketer, you start in one small place. Don't make a big song and dance about it. Do something small and meaningful, and then do it in 10 more places, and then you can start talking about it. But again, start small and then build up from there. I think it's good to do games. You know, I think a lot of Business Playground is about playfulness and games, and we've obviously talked about gaming. People love games. It's a great way of engaging with people, and I think you can do that internally, not just with consumers, but you can actually create a game format where you're getting people to compete against each other internally to create some great new marketing. And I think using people within an organization better is what crowdsourcing is about. It's not just about using consumers, it's also about using the internal resource. Define your enemy, we've talked about that. Define your enemy and then work out how you're going to challenge them in an interesting way through your marketing. I think getting a small experimental budget, and this certainly applies to big advertisers who put all of their money in the big stuff that you can measure, but I think there's a lot of value in finding really small budgets and just almost not looking at it, just giving it to somebody to go and play with and see what they can come back with. And I think if you give them that freedom, often you come back with much more interesting things. Ask great questions. You know, one of the most important things in coming up with ideas is framing the problem in the right way. And I think, you know, look at some companies like Nokia. They asked a question about what business they should be in the 1980s. They were, up until that point, they were selling rubber boots, they were selling paper products, they were selling lumber, and then they had some mobile phones. And the CEO came in and said, what business are we in? We're selling in all these different areas. We've got no specialty. What should we be doing? And that led to a huge change in the culture, and they became the biggest handset manufacturer in the world, and they sold all those other businesses. They're now asking questions about what business they're in, and they're realizing that they can no longer be just a mobile set manufacturer because it's become a commodity. So they're trying to get in the content game and entertainment game. You know, Einstein said there's no such thing as a bad question. The only bad question is the question not asked. And I think that's really important. Ask questions of yourself about what you're doing and why you're doing it. Don't outsource all of your creativity. I talked about this earlier, which is if you outsource it to other people, you're missing a huge opportunity to do some really interesting things throughout the whole decision-making process. And don't go for gold each time. Create a culture of constant ideas. One of the things that we found out when researching the book is that quantity of ideas is the biggest predictor of creativity. So everyone, again, is looking for a big idea, but actually people who can come up with more ideas are more likely to come up with a better idea. So if you want to know who's a creative person, ask them how many ideas they can come up with for a particular product or particular problem. And that person is more likely to be creative. And I think you can train yourself to do that. You can make yourself come up with more and more ideas and then weed through the other stuff to come up with a really good one. You know, I live in LA, and, you know, Hollywood is this weird beast, and, you know, it's clearly at the forefront of this content marketing gaming experience thing. Hollywood's got some really good things about it. And I think one thing I've noticed is the way people collaborate is incredible. You know, they get together in small teams. They're a small production company, or they're an individual writer, an individual director, an individual developer, or an investor. And they collaborate in small teams to make something that as individuals they could never do. And I think often in marketing we don't do that. What we tend to do is keep within our own walls and look over our shoulders hoping nobody's looking at us. But I think we can learn a lot from both collaborating internally with other people from departments you might not normally look at, and also collaborating with people outside who have something to offer that we can benefit from. So that's it. I think we're going to have a Q&A now, right, Daniel? Have we got any time? Have I used all the time? Okay. Some questions, you think? Okay, you got questions. Okay.